Hello once again. After having a discussion on social entrepreneurship, innovation, association of entrepreneurship with innovation and especially with sustainability, and elaborating upon the context of societal development with reference to sustainability, or let us say with reference to entrepreneurship to propel sustainability or establish sustainability, it is our duty and a logical progression to understand that what are those conditions which promote innovation in a sustainable manner to propel sustainability and entrepreneurship at large. How to look upon the whole of this scenario, and definitely there are so many actors which can be listed for this purpose, which we will do also. But here is a context which is extremely relevant to be dwelled upon beforehand, and the context is to be summarized in one key word, that is called that can be concern. Concern of everyone with reference to societal development and sustainability through entrepreneurship, with a logical support of innovation. Innovation, we have referred to insights also which propel innovation, we have referred to design thinking also which actually carries forward the innovation. So there is a whole lot of thinking process which is associated with this, but then concern is the key word. Are we into it? Do we share this concern? If someone is referring to Ganges or a project is going on, do we have enough support which is garnered towards this kind of an effort? Are we all into it? Sometimes I find we are not, because when I visit these places, as I referred to in our last discussion besides Ganges, and I look at the people who come for the purpose of entertaining themselves or getting away from their daily routine lives for weekends or let us say for particular occasions, when I look at their gestures, when I look at their approach, I doubt that we share this concern towards saving Ganges and reducing pollution and so on. It is a general tendency what we have developed in due course of time is that until and unless it comes as a devastating disaster to us, or we become sufferers individually to that kind of a thing, we do not tend to refer to such kind of things with a larger context. Just a brief digression, although it is connected to sustainability, entrepreneurship and innovation as such, it is very important. Reduction in terms of accidents, or let us say precautions which can be associated with road transport and accidents. We have been sharing this concern with each other for a longer time, but I have realized that people who unfortunately have suffered because of this or are in due course of time, they are slightly more concerned, or let us say more concerned, because they have gone through a particular loss, or they have gone through a particular blow in their lives. Many people who actually can sensitively feel, they are also related to this concern, but most of the times we realize that people are not into it. People are not following the norms which can reduce accidents, or let us say people are not following a behavior which should be mandatory for every one of us to be followed to reduce the level of menace which accidents have caused, and to reduce the number of deaths caused by these accidents, to reduce the devastation which accidents bring in. So, coming back to the subject, when I go along the river stretch, I feel that people, they create so much of waste and they go back and they don't look back. I realize that we are not actually sharing the concern which we should. So, who are those people? Who are the elements? What are the what should be the characteristic of those elements which should be associated with the subject of innovation sustainable conditions, or the conditions which could sustain innovation as well as sustainability at large, which should be the resultant of what we have realized in due course of time. So, one is government, definitely. So, their role is to draw policies which can bring in innovation at the foreground, and definitely in coherence with the sustainability and entrepreneurship. For example, government can definitely announce on the projects or kind of advantages to be given to the entrepreneurs or people or innovators who are thinking in terms of sustainability or measures of sustainability or elements of sustainability, or who are thinking towards the larger societal benefits. Government should also support those efforts with reference to their brand development, bringing them to the forum of discussions. You see, what happens is integrated marketing communication has brought tools to us which create brand awareness, and definitely is associated with what kind of money is to be supported, or what kind of kind of integrated marketing communication channels are effectively used, and how campaigns are designed and devised. But it's definitely kind of apparently visible also, and theoretically proven also, academically also proven, that the efforts which have more commercial viability, or let us say are supported with lots of persistent efforts in terms of putting in money and channelizing integrated marketing communication, those have eligibility for larger brand awareness in terms of organizations or products. And on the other side, efforts which are more relevant for the societal development, or let us say directly associated with the societal development, which we tend to call social communication, or cause related communication. Those efforts, because they do not have a direct resultant in terms of gaining immediate profits out of that communication, those are not so consistent, and definitely they do not yield that kind of an awareness which other efforts do. So, what government can do here in terms of, for example, there is a rate differentiation for government supported efforts, and then there is price differentiation in several media. Department of Audio Visual Publicity has a price differentiation in that context. So, that price differentiation can be extended towards the efforts which are entrepreneurially being made for the societal development, and that can be justifiably weighed not just against the rules made, but by the rational panel, and it should be open to the public scrutiny as well, so that larger brand awareness about such kind of efforts can come to fore. I will just quote one example. Many people and many of those who require such kind of a help, they know Arvind Eye Care, and that is a wonderful effort which has been made by this organization as far as ophthalmic care goes. But sometimes I find people who do not know about such kind of efforts and who are not aware about such kind of efforts, although these efforts now have taken a very large shape. But I am very happy to share with you, when you go abroad, and once I was talking to a clinic which is run by the name of Dr. Consorta in Brazil, Sao Paulo. That clinic is focusing on masses through entrepreneurial effort, definitely, but bringing in healthcare at the level of masses. So we were talking to those people, and we said that your model resembles many models alive in this world, but from where do you take this inspiration, and whom do you imitate? So they immediately named Arvind Eye Care. And that was a delight for us to understand that an Indian organization who has been making such kind of efforts in terms of innovation in processes as well as healthcare, they are known worldwide, though not so or good, nicely known in India, but not so much known in India as they should have been, kind of. So that is a take in where government can put in as far as this efforts goes. Now let's come to corporates. What corporates can do? There is a CSR policy wherein people have to spend a particular percentage on socially responsible projects, and it is almost it is mandatory. There are some legalities associated with such kind of efforts. Corporates are being roped in, corporates are becoming more socially agile and socially concerned. That is for sure, things are changing. But the point is that what actually corporates should willfully do, how corporates can nurture the environment of innovation with an entrepreneurial perspective, rationally diverting those things towards their organizational development and profit development as such, but having a context of sustainability there. I was talking to few companies who are into the business of fertilizer manufacturing. It's a debatable kind of a thing. They also share this kind of a concern. They just cannot go away from that business so easily. Fertilizers are required for further growth of food grains, but it has become a matter of debate in due course of time that to what extent we should be using those kind of things, and there is an alternative side of the farming methodology which is now being propelled and now being projected. But what fertilizer companies should do? So have they been infusing in money for technological development as such? If they are, it is a positive sign. For example, I have been talking to sugar industry people. Now what kind of aspects they are employing as far as utilization of energy goes? Are they infusing innovation for rational usage of energy for their for sugar production, or they are going for conventional means and methods? What I have realized in due course of time, sugar industry is working in three areas: on generating electricity or power generation, sugar manufacturing, as well as byproducts in terms of alcohol, which is now tending to become a major product by the sugar industry. Now what kind of effects that alcohol production would bring in for as far as our societal aspect goes, that has to be seen, and that is debatable also. But could we think in terms of some vertical integration processes for further rationalizing sugar production and power generation, and not so much depending upon alcohol production, or let us say could we think in terms of further rational utilization of bagasse? Could we bring in other resources in this process? While we were developing this machine of for briquetting, forest bio residue based briquetting, and I showed these briquettes to some of the sugar manufacturers, they said that it can well be utilized in their process, and they can spare bagasse for let us say paper production, which can definitely positively affect on as far as reduction of cutting the trees and reducing carbon emissions. So, that can be one part, but have they been trying for such kind of thing? So, corporates, they have to think in terms of lots of technological innovations and lots of work culture innovation for actually thinking in terms of sustainability, and those have to be associated with entrepreneurial results as such. So, that is what they can do. What individuals can do? Individuals, they must have a portion of their work lives and their personal lives associated with direct impact on as far as innovation and sustainability goes, if not entrepreneurship kind of. And we should develop a culture of developing future entrepreneurs in our house by promoting youngsters to go towards entrepreneurship as such. That is a long point to be discussed, but and institutions are working hard on this. But the point is that individuals, they have a direct role in dialogue, their actions, discussions, and nurturing innovation at every level in let us say household management or waste management. They have to bring in locally developed ways and means of as far as managing their own lives with innovation goes. So, individuals, then in our country, I have found that there is a lesser culture of interaction of individuals or people in daily lives with intelligentsia who is working at research levels, and those kind of research seminars or conferences are being attended by the people specifically connected to those kind of subjects and not by masses. So, then definitely academia can organize seminars and discussion forums for people who from all walks of life, apart from the students and specifically connected people. Now, academia has further and a very large role to play as far as innovation, sustainability and entrepreneurship and sustaining innovation sustaining conditions also, wherein academia has to take a call that major research diversion should not be random, but it should be in coherence with each other. As far as interdisciplinarity goes, several departments and several researchers should be coherently diverted towards a larger goal. That is one part. So, and slightly a difficult part, but to start with, academia can think in terms of diverting major attention towards innovation having direct application for sustainability and societal causes, which can easily be done, and then several large researches can be deeply associated with each other. So, culture is being nurtured and developed, and wherein people are made aware of what is going on besides their own domain, and how they can well associate other domains with their domain or get associated with other domains to bring larger results. That is definitely coming to fore. But for example, in my stream, management and market development and those, we have not been witnessing interdisciplinarity at large, wherein we have not been exactly focusing on the applications of the art of management and market development and entrepreneurship with lots of efforts which are going on. So, as I have been mentioning time and again, that we were focusing on we focused upon developing or utilizing forest bioresidue for fuel purposes or energy generation purposes and so on. And it is a huge resource and a waste actually, which has to be utilized somehow to come out of the menace which it creates in terms of forest fires. So we have been working on that, and lots of interdisciplinarity was associated or had to be associated with that kind of a cause, wherein we had to bring in people from mechanical engineering, and we had to bring in people from alternative energy sources, we have to bring in people from rural technology, we have to bring in scientists from several walks of, and students from several walks of lives, and so on, and a lot of brainstorming was done, and a lot of roles were being played in due course of time to develop a single machine by so many kinds of people. I remember a project which was which has been nurtured and still is being nurtured by my friend Professor Agarwal, Professor Rajat Agarwal, on low cost transportation in terms of enhancing the efficiency of pedal based rickshaw to make it more comfortable and efficient as far as its speed or kind of other elements go, so that it can bring in more money for the rickshaw puller as well as more comfort for the customer, and it can become a viable alternative to several transports. And because it does not require any sort of energy support, largely, or may not require any sort of energy support which he foresees, it will become an environment friendly mode of transportation, which is a wonderful thing to be seen for future generations. So these kind of efforts are being made, but in pockets, and these kind of efforts have to be largely propelled, wherein physical form of output should come in terms of, as far as bringing in innovation for the usage of societal development and sustainability in due course of time. Media has a very large role to play, as I can foresee. We have been approaching several channels or media vehicles for popularizing the kind of efforts. Today educational institutions have started engaging public relations related organizations for propelling the kind of efforts which they are making, so that people get aware of that so many things are being done, and entrepreneurs come forward and get associated with academia. Organizations, they support academia with more funds to propel those innovations, but again that is very specific and that is pocketed, because that might not bring in direct advertisers to support such kind of news releases or let us say media releases. And if advertisers do not come, from where media would recover their costs of time and space. But then again, there has to be a debate on that, does media think in terms of bringing in advertisers who can relate themselves with such kind of efforts through specially designed campaigns. And I definitely laud the campaign, for example Jago Re by Tata Tea, which has a social cause and social element to that, and definitely it is a commercial product, and everyone has a win-win kind of a situation. So it is propelling a particular social cause. So such kind of campaigns can be devised for propelling the efforts, or let us say making such kind of efforts visible for the people, and media would also not lose on as far as their possibility of revenue goes. So what should we do? We should do everything. And whom should we bring in first? There is no first and second on this. We should bring all together as far as these efforts they go. So and what specifically has to be the kind of sequence, first is resource allocation, and it is a very important thing to be done. One must come out of the frame of structured accounting processes. Those are relevant, those are to be followed mandatorily, and one can only measure business and entrepreneurial efforts and even non-entrepreneurial efforts for such kind of things. But definitely while keeping that frame aside, one resource allocation has to be thought of in a particular portion with a long term benefit and gains associated with those kind of such kind of innovations and efforts and sustainability and societal development. As I said that Jamshedji long back thought of going to the business of power, steel and scientific education, and that was not a business for him. So but he wanted to all these things to be associated together in a larger frame of context. So, scientific education would come. So, definitely scientists would evolve, and those scientists definitely would contribute in their organizational development as such, but that has to have a very broader frame of thought, and definitely Tatas, they have reaped fruits of that. So, that is quite visible also. So, then there is a cultural aspect to be focused upon. You visit several countries, for example, Singapore is definitely a good example of how they rose to heights by developing a culture and environment. Japan definitely holds respect amongst people on these kind of aspects, and they are definitely monitoring the sustainable aspects related to innovation and entrepreneurship, and so many efforts are being made. For example, Singapore, they definitely utilize desalination for their water needs, and they have tried to curtail the cost as well, and they have gone for rooftop agriculture and wall based agriculture, or let us say growing plants on roofs and so on. And they have been working on all walks of lives with innovative perspective, which has larger entrepreneurial results as such. Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, and all these countries, they have been focusing on sustainable use of their resources. So, culture has evolved, and that culture is reflected in the curriculum as well as the imparting of education, as well as thought process of the people, government policies, and everything all together. So, diverting the attention of all towards such kind of a thing is the most important thing which is required. Youth has to be diverted from a thought of only self opulence towards their contribution towards societal development, and as I said when we were opening up this discussion, that sustainability has to be seen with all the three perspectives, the generation which is following up, the generation which is ahead of someone, and generation which has also the generation which has yet to come. So, youth has to be made agile on these accounts, that how they should be thinking in terms of such kind of an opulence which would be there for after they live. So, youth has overtly been focusing on gaining money for their own usage and practically enjoying their lives. So, that has not only socially depleted the situation, but marketing wise also, and entrepreneurially also, and larger market development also. We have found that organizations are not getting benefited, and one hint on this is that there is a context of customer loyalty which had been there. Now organizations are losing upon that, because youth is thinking in terms of just their benefits from wherever they get those benefits. So, they are not willing to sponsor or support the organizations with a particular kind of a customer loyalty, because of the marginal gains which the competitors or let us say substitutes and alternatives they give them. So, that is one part. The other part which is very important to be understood here is that there are several elders or people beyond a certain age within a certain age bracket or beyond a certain age limit in kind of late 50s or early 60s, who have lots of potential available with them to be utilized for a longer time for the societal gain, as well as propelling the economy or contributing within the economy. I have found many people, especially in larger organizations, wherein people have worked hard to come up to a certain level, and now they are losing the sheen in their work lives, and they are diverting sort of their attention towards their retirement planning and what they would do after 2-3 years, and for coolly spending rest of their working lives, and then moving away and living their lives happily, and they are focusing more on settling their families and supporting the family at larger level, slightly getting away from the main cause of what they have lived up to. So, this lot or these people have to be reminded of that they still have to play a very efficient role as far as the societal development and innovation perspective goes, because they have accumulated knowledge which definitely has to be precisely utilized for propelling the innovation which has yet to evolve, and that knowledge has to be utilized cumulatively and in coherence with so many other resources. So then there is an element of unemployed people from the section of voluntary unemployment. I have personally witnessed in many of the states in India that voluntary unemployment is rising because people, they have slightly gained accumulated wealth through several measures of selling their lands, or they are getting foreign remittances from the family members who go abroad to study, and that remittance is supporting their livelihood very comfortably in wherever they are staying, and so on. There are several things which are happening around, and people are tending to move away from work at all, and they just want to live their lives happily by having some bank deposits and so on. So it's okay, it is a part of economic structure which we are going through. Banking system is gaining through their deposits and somehow, but again we are losing upon a very good potential workforce which can contribute at a larger level as far as their lives go. So such kind of people have to be reminded of as far as voluntary contribution towards the development of society and innovation, and once they would contribute, definitely they would propel in few things which definitely would propel innovation, and so on the cycle would rise. So then there is an aspect of criticism and skepticism which is a softer part, but has to be the part of the cultural development. We should not be over critical and skeptical on things whatever is going around us, and we should not question almost everything which is going around us. First we should propel or let us say we should propose our specific role in the societal development, and we should play that specific role in the societal development and propelling innovation and developing the environment around innovation, and then we should be thinking in terms of questioning which is happening around us. So there are organizations, for example Agastya Foundation, which is playing a wonderful role in bringing in science to the grassroots level, at the village level, at the levels of the individual, and taking vans or even taking scientific experiments on motorcycles to the villages for developing a scientific acumen of the future youth of India by educating children, and that effort is laudable. So that is what I am trying to express here, that those kind of efforts have to be blown up, and people should know about such kind of efforts. That is what I am referring to at this moment. So the ultimate aspect is to develop belief that things would change if we contribute positively. Thank you.